Thank you, Maruf, for the introduction. I'm going to shift the stage from India to the global world. And I find India generates so much heat, light, and humor and passion that I don't think I'm going to match up with all that has happened just now. So all the excitement, I think, is going to come to a slightly slower pace of what I'm going to talk about. The world today is being described as uneven, unbalanced, unequal, unstable, and unsustainable. And I'm sure you can add a lot many more uns to that. But to me, the paradox is that this should not have happened. The fruits of globalization were supposed to have evened out all the unevenness. Now, interdependence, which is what is globalization is about interdependence, is not something new. You and I both know it. And interdependence we've known through trade and war for centuries. But what has happened recently is that with rapid advancement of technology and communication, interdependence has grown. It has grown in trade, it has grown in capital flows, it's grown in investments. And when I live in London, and when I go to the grocery store, I buy vegetables from Africa, from fruits from New Zealand. I can see in India, drive cars which have been made in the Japanese cars, Korean, German cars. The parts have been manufactured in Southeast Asia, assembled in somewhere else. So we're all living in this globalized world, and of course we are all consuming oil, which we know is coming from the Middle East at the moment, and I'm coming to that in a little while. But yet globalization didn't unfold the way we all thought it would. And I'm going to submit to you that there is a new world order emerging, which is going to challenge all the assumptions that we've had up to now. And I'm going to take you, these are sort of 4 broad assumptions that I'm going to talk about. The first assumption is that globalization was irreversible. Everybody was supposed to benefit. The developed world was supposed to reach a new level of growth. But what do we see? Double-dip recession, unemployment, and very poor prospects of growth at home. If we look at the developing nations, they feel that the rich nations actually used globalization in their own favor, and that even when in the developing nations some people did prosper, particularly China and Southeast Asian countries, where export was big, there was no trickle-down effect, and I heard that so many times being said there, that it was only the rich and at the top who prospered with that. So they're agitating against globalization. In the developed world, because of recession, there's a whole lot of protectionism, and that should not surprise us. There are jobs moving out of those countries, so they're putting up very restrictive immigration barriers and trade restrictions. So, it's interesting that both the haves and the have-nots are trying to reverse globalization. My second assumption is that we all thought that the global epicenter, the epicenter for global energy, was always going to be the Middle East. But today, America, and I just attended a conference in Sun Valley, where it is quite clear that the US has discovered huge reserves of shale gas and oil, and is well on its way to becoming energy independent. Now, this is the biggest upset of all, and it has ramifications, global ramifications, both economic and political. Now, think of the shift in the foreign policy of the US as it becomes energy independent. The geopolitical priorities are going to change. As it turns to Asia and Africa, it is not surprising that the leaders in the Middle East are going to get worried. That is their lifeline. The whole economy is based on that. And it was interesting while I was there, we cannot rule out a strike by Israel on Iran. So, and I was told in no uncertain terms that there could be war after the US election. Not could be, but there's a very strong likelihood of war post the American elections. And you can see the whole geopolitical landscape changing. If we look at Europe, The biggest supplier of oil for Europe, energy, is Russia. If Europe moves and makes the preferred supplier as the US, which, obviously, for obvious reasons, they don't want to rely on Russia, that's going to mean a much weakened Russia. In addition, there are new petrostates, what I'm calling petrostates, emerging in Africa and Latin America. And there are a whole new economic and power centers emerging in the world, and that is weakening the petro-czars of the previous years. This certainly means that the cost of energy will become more reasonable. Will that give an impetus to India and China? And that's a question. A third assumption I will submit is that the BRIC countries would lead the world back to prosperity. But what do we see here? That the big giants, China and India, are grappling with domestic politics. The question on everybody's lips is China going to have a hard landing? And I think the jury's out there, and people have, it's divided, their opinions are divided on that. The question on India is, will India capitalize on its strengths and be able to face the deficit? And of course, the elections are on the horizon. Will UPA strike gold this time? Nobody knows. And this is, again, the risk attached to these countries is growing. In China had always been open for business. It has huge inflows of foreign domestic investment, billions of dollars. But now the cost of entering China and the cost of doing business there is becoming very high because the government is trying to promote national champions over multinational companies. So can the world rely on China today, earlier when they could not even ignore it? My fourth assumption, and I think this is very interesting, is that we assume that economics always trumps politics. And what has the Eurozone crisis shown us? That is not so. It's politics that trumps economics. Chancellor Merkel will find it very hard to explain to the German people that they have to work harder. Why? Because they have to bail out Greece, Portugal, and Spain. And what is the German view on the bailout? They don't want to bail out Greece. What is the view of the Spaniards? They want to drop euro and return to their local currency. So you can see that there is a rise of the nation state. The blocs are disintegrating. And you can see it in India. Some of the reforms which make such clear economic sense are blocked because of political compulsions. And I think governments everywhere are now today much more sensitive to domestic needs rather than looking at the global marketplace, the demands of the global discipline that is required. And that is happening across the world. What do these assumptions tell us? You can see that the world is actually trying to disconnect and disengage with each other. And I think a bigger thing is that the world has become unequal. It is not flat. And I would submit that it is becoming angular and curved. So what happened to bring us to this stage? I think that there were unintended consequences of globalization. And I'm going to talk about three, which I think are the more important ones, and the others probably can be grouped with these. I think first, the developed and the rich nations played using unfair rules, and they played to their strengths rather than to the poorer nation's strengths. And yet, they are going through regression and unemployment. So they did not benefit. The whole idea was that they would benefit more. They were the stronger people. It was an unequal, asymmetric marketplace, but they did not win. Second, I think the unintended consequence from their point of view is that the world has become multipolar. For 3 decades, US has led the world and we followed. They were the single most important and powerful voice in the world. But today, we know that some of the richest countries although they're not, they're poor people in rich countries. I'm talking about China and India, where per capita income is very low. But if you aggregate that, the GDP is huge, and it's only going to grow. These are going, China and India are going to be the top 3 richest nations in the world in coming years. We've got new petro-states, as I was talking about. And these countries, these poor countries, these developing countries are going to become the resource centers for energy, for manufacturing, for information technology, for services. And let me remind you that 86% of the world lives in these countries. These are the consumer markets. With stagnation in the developed worlds, if they have to look at us, they have to come here, and they're going to rely on us for these. So, you know, this multipolar world, from their point of view, became an unintended consequence of globalization. I think third, and I think this is very important, globalization calls for a global management system and governance. And institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the ILO, WTO, they were all created to actually govern and manage this system. But unfortunately, they failed to act in a democratic and anti-partisan way because it was a unipolar world. They were created by the rich nations, and they became his master's voice. So they did not actually take into consideration the poorer nations. They were not given a seat on the table. They were not allowed to express their views. And Stiglitz, who's the big guru of globalization, he argues that in many cases, IMF actually forced developing economies who were in debt to adopt economic policies which brought them grief much later. And you know, there are many examples, and I'm not going to go into that. WTO failed to set proper norms for wages and environmental degradation, and we've spoken a lot about that, and that created the inequality which we see, and which is seen as the outcome or the fallout of globalization. But I think it was just poor management by all these you know, supposedly democratic institutions. And you know, the list can go on. So what is the road ahead? Where do we go from here? I think there are several lessons from the assumptions, the new world order that I spoke about, and the unintended consequences of globalization. I think one thing is clear, that when you're sharing a world, when you're sharing a planet, serving self-interest by a few nations at the expense of poorer nations who cannot speak up, who don't have the money, who don't have the resources, is not going to work. And I want to explain that by an example. Who wants to have a poor neighbor? You and I all know the cost of having a poor neighbor. We have first-hand knowledge of that. And I'm not going to talk about our neighbors. We all know about that. I'm going to use an example slightly away from home. America signed a treaty with Mexico, the NAFTA treaty. And you know, the Mexicans were very, very happy. It was supposed to bring prosperity to them. But it was so heavily biased in favor of the US that Mexico, after a few years, actually became poorer. And the drug lords took over. And the drugs and the drug money actually leaked back into the US. So I don't think today we can say, I'm okay, it's I'm okay, you're okay. So I think we have to make sure that our neighbors and the rest of the world prospers with us. And I think that is one of the lessons from these unintended consequences of globalization. I think powerful nations need to take steps to tilt the favor away from themselves and back to the developing nations. Now, what steps can they take? And I'm going to talk about, you know, just a few, but I think they encompass quite a lot of ground. I think one is we're looking for fair, not free trade. Free trade is between equal partners who have equal voices, but there is disparity in this world. There's asymmetry. For developing nations, it becomes uncompetitive to sell agricultural produce to America. And we know, we've heard so much, 70% of you know, the world of our country lives there, and so it is true for developing nations. They haven't yet urbanized. That is the backbone of the economy of these developing nations. So that is certainly not fair. They have to actually truly give true access to their markets by dropping their subsidies and also dropping the non-tariff barriers, which include anti-dumping laws, which, those are, I think, loopholes they find when they find that they cannot compete on price. It is said that in Europe, it's better to be a cow in Europe than a poor man in a developing nation, because the cows get $2 per day, and that is defined as the poverty line for developing nations. The second step, I think, they have to stop perpetrating bribery and corruption. We have heard so much about bribery and corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to propose, and Mr. Dhol said that capital is like water. It finds its own level. It is looking for returns, so it will go there. And with the rapid growth in developing nations, they're like a magnet, they're attracting capital and investment. But in a bid to make a quick buck, and these are poor countries, poorly paid officials, businessmen, and professionals, they succumb to corruption. And I'd like to tell you that OECD, many countries, bribery is actually a tax-deductible expense. And many countries, they do not want to get their hands dirty, so they employ facilitators who will do this job for them. But the unfortunate bit is that these ill-gotten gains do not remain in the country. So you are stripping the country of the assets. This money actually finds its way in a tax haven, or I was listening to Alexander Lebedev. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a big Russian oligarch who's a media oligarch. He was speaking in London. And he was telling powers to be in London that if they thought that they were isolated from the corruption and bribery in developing nations, they were very mistaken, because there's been privatization in Russia, and all that money which should have been invested in Russia is finding its way into London property. Now, London property is very, sound. They're very sound. So in many ways, money not just from Russia, but from Greece, from Spain, Portugal, it's all coming out and coming into the developed nations. So I think there's a perpetrator and there is a person who takes the bribe. And I think it is, I would put the onus on these countries to stop corruption at the root. I think my third step, which I would like to talk about it, is that they should stop irresponsible business practices which lead to environmental degradation. And there are many examples of that. You've heard Ms. Nandi talk about it. We talked about Union Carbide is, of course, the most famous. It's right in our backyard. But there are several others. This particularly happens in resource-rich countries in Africa and in Latin America. And these countries are too poor, and they can't afford expensive legal lawsuits. They don't have the voice. They don't know the global system. I think companies have to be, the multinationals have to be made accountable for these externalities. They take the profits and then they walk out, leaving a mess behind. And we do not have a proper legal or financial global framework. They would be held accountable in their own country, but they will not be held. There is no global system to hold them accountable. And I think fourth, which is very important for India, I think they have to stop creating global monopolies. And I think I like this idea of very much. Advanced nations have a lot of money. They are capital rich. They spend a lot on research and development. They can afford it. But what do they do with that? They create intellectual property rights and patents. That is akin to a monopoly that does not allow other people to work in that area. If you're looking about life-saving drugs, and if that has a patent, that can be the difference between life and death for poor nations. They have to bring down the taxes on prices on that. They even delay generic drugs. They have laws to delay generic drugs in developing nations. So that, because generic drugs are much cheaper, and if they're available, then obviously the patented brands are not going to sell. And I just ask this question, is that not better than giving aid? And this whole philanthropic idea, which is, a big thing in the West, is it not better to drop the prices and taxes on life-saving drugs rather than give millions in aid? These are just a few instances of how globalization can be good for all. And the question is, can it be reversed? I don't think so. I think the genie's out of the bottle. It has helped a lot of people. There are a lot of people who've prospered. We know that in India. We know in developing nations. And also technology is not something that can be put back. It's only going to advance more. And so I think that's something we should not even consider. Does globalization need regulation? Does it need a global management system? We saw that without it, with bodies which were not democratic, it didn't work. People were fighting. They wanted to fight globalization. They wanted to reverse it. So I think it is important to create the right democratic institutions and to make sure, give them the authority and governance to run these things. But I think the challenge, I don't have solutions for it, but I think the challenge is to create a global, legal, and financial framework. And I think to stop the rich nations, and somewhat like, I see the metaphor as raiders of yesteryears who come and loot and take away the assets. In this case, they're slightly in a different form. They will not carry away things, but they do strip assets from these developing nations and take away the money. Thank you.